Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to what we hope will be the first of many connections we make with our Warburg program here at Simmons University. My name is Dr. Leanne Doherty. I use she, hers pronouns, and I am the chair of the Political Science and International Relations Department here at Simmons. I'm delighted to be here because it's been a 2-year hiatus for our Warburg program, and once again, we are back. Even though we are not back in person where we would typically have cookies and delightful conversation, I'm hoping that you might have a cookie in front of you right now, a beverage of your choice, and we continue to have delightful conversation. Before I introduce Ambassador Doherty today, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Warburg program. It was established in 1983 by Joan Melba Warburg, class of 1945, in honor of her late husband, who was a distinguished State Department worker in his own right. The Warburg Chair in International Relations teaches a senior seminar for us, which Tom is doing right now. We'll work on that audio for folks if they're having a little trouble. Hope this is a little better. And we, since 1983, have been honored to host a Warburg Chair in the department. This year, we were able to successfully secure a new member of our team, Ambassador Tom Doherty, who is joining me on the panel today. No relation. He and I spell our names differently. I think we'll tell this joke for a while around campus, just to make sure everybody knows that. But Ambassador Doherty retired from the Foreign Service Department in July of 2016 after a 27-year career that included his time as ambassador to Burkina Faso from 2010 to 2013, and then Deputy Chief of Mission in Australia from 2013 to 2016. He has served at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and the Bureau of African Affairs as Office Director for West Africa, then Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary. His last official post was working for the Fulbright Scholarship Association in Australia, where he spent the last couple of years until he made his way back to the States, to his home state of Wyoming, and then to us here in Massachusetts. Ambassador Doherty will be leading us in a discussion today where you can put questions in the chat or in the Q&A around the 20-year war in Afghanistan. It seemed like a timely opportunity for him to use his expertise in his own career as Foreign Service to talk to us about the situation in Afghanistan, which seems like a very minor word. Situation is not probably the best word to use. But as Tom learned from me yesterday, my two favorite words are wow and interesting when I don't really know what to say in the space. So Tom's going to speak to us for a couple minutes, and then I will help moderate a Q&A. So feel free to add questions as Tom is talking, and I look forward to an engaging conversation. Ambassador Doherty, welcome to Simmons.
Thanks very much. It's really, really good to be here at Simmons. Probably less good and less exciting to be talking on this really, wow, interesting topic today. So for the benefit of everyone that's listening, wanted to let you know that, I was really happy to participate in the kind of brown bag conversations that Professor Doherty mentioned take place around the Warburg. Probably, yes, better with cookies and with a drink as well, a favorite beverage, and it would be a strong one when we're talking about Afghanistan, I'd have to say. But when it was obvious that the topic that was the most important to be talking about at this time in the US was Afghanistan, I really thought, oh gosh, what do you say about a 20-year war that has ended the way that it has? And would have very much liked to have talked about almost anything else. And I thought, oh gosh, what do you say about Afghanistan? Can I really articulate the policy and the mission that we had there? I have too little knowledge, although I served in Iraq and had relevant similar type of experiences. It was a real tough ask, but a really, really important one, because what's happened in Afghanistan is going to have implications, I think, for the next certainly generation or two of foreign service and military practitioners. And so there's some really important lessons that need to be drawn from the experience. I think Americans have a lot of great characteristics, but one or two of the ones that we have that aren't so great is we talk about learning lessons, but more often than not, we observe lessons and then just rush off to the next thing. We have a tendency to do things very quickly and ad hoc. And we also have a tendency to do it in the way that we think is right for America without necessarily spending enough time or enough sophisticated analysis to see if it's appropriate elsewhere. Again, when I was asked to talk about Afghanistan, of course said yes, and only felt a little bit better about it when I started really doing a lot more work and research. So we're all quite lucky that Congress appointed a commission, a special inspector general for Afghanistan reconstruction, but we're really lucky that the Washington Post sued for that information of the lessons that had initially been learned through SIGIR, and published a book and commentary in the Post called the Afghanistan Papers. We're also lucky that the military has been interviewing returning personnel for many years in the time that the Afghanistan war was taking place. And what I learned when I did a little bit of research is I'm not as, well, I am clueless, but so is everyone else. It was truly depressing and, wow, interesting to go back to when you don't know what else to say, to read that the lieutenant general that was appointed to be the czar for Presidents Bush and Obama on Iraq and Afghanistan, when he was interviewed, said, and I'm going to read it as a direct quote because it really does rather take your breath away. And this was well over 14 years after the beginning of the war. He said, quote, "We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking." Equally sobering is the comment that was made by the British commander of the NATO and the US forces when he came in 2007 and asked, well, what is the strategy? And was told, well, there really isn't a strategy. We have tactics, but we haven't developed a strategy yet. This was 6 years after the fighting had begun. Likewise, when the American commander took over McNeil and asked in Washington, at the Pentagon, at the White House, well, tell me, what does winning look like? And no one really was in a position to be able to tell him what it looked like. So at that point, I felt, well, if everybody else is as clueless as I personally am, then it would be good to have a discussion. So Professor Doherty asked me to speak for about 20 minutes on a 20-year war, which is going to be a bit of a challenge. It's a little bit, I think, like a 1-minute thesis or speed dating. There's a lot that could be said, but what I thought might be most useful is just outlining a few things, coming to the end of it and pointing out some places where we really do, as a country, need to come to some discussion points for lessons to be learned, and then mostly open it up to questions and answers. And Professor Doherty had told me yesterday that some people that are watching today are grad students at Simmons that are veterans, and I'd be very, very interested in hearing their perspectives of what went on. But before we go on, I think with a war that's taken place for 20 years, it'd be wrong for those of us who are older, like me, to assume that everyone has a background in why we got into Afghanistan in the first place. I think a sobering statistic is that 1 out of every 4 American citizens wasn't even born when we went into Afghanistan in 2001. So I'm going to give you a real quick bit of background to put things in context. There's no way that we can cover all of the issues of 20 years of conflict and construction and reconstruction and very, very complicated issues. But I do think it's important to give it a little bit of context. So first of all, although it's become a cliche, Afghanistan for a long, long time, centuries, has been called the graveyard of empires. And it's because a lot of folks have had bad experiences there. We can go back to the Persians. We can go back to Alexander the Great. and the Greeks, although he had the good sense of getting out quite quickly, which is in retrospect probably what we should have done as well. The Arabs, the Mongols, the Ottoman Turks, certainly the British twice, and most importantly, I think for the context of what we'll be talking about today, the Soviet Union from 1979 to 1989. So the Soviet Union came in to Afghanistan with the idea of creating a government that was going to be helpful for it to control this. Afghanistan is a really tough country geographically, but it's really in the crossroads of Asia, between North, South, East, and West Asia. And the Soviet Union went in 79 with goals that were to prop up a Soviet-leaning government that they wanted to impose. We, the United States, did everything in our power to oppose the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And that included supporting a number of groups, the Taliban, or the precursors for the Taliban, and foreign fighters who had gone to Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, with the goal of resisting the Soviet occupation. Among those that we supported and had direct contacts with through the CIA was one Osama bin Laden. But getting back to the enemy of my enemy suddenly becomes my friend. We wanted very much to see the Soviet Union leave Afghanistan. It did in defeat, but with a much more orderly withdrawal than what we saw in August ourselves, and left in 1989, leaving a very fragile government in place that fell about 3 years later. When that government fell, warlords and fighting took place, and by 1996, the Taliban had moved in. And I know that you all are aware of the rigidity and the fundamentalist nature of the Taliban government, and why it would not be a government that we would have wanted to support. But we didn't do anything about the Taliban, and we didn't pay any attention to it until September 11th. 9/11 happened in 2001. And with the attacks on the World Trade Center that took place 20 years ago, very, very quickly afterwards, we determined, within hours, that it was Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda who had been responsible for the attack, and that they had planned that attack from Afghanistan, where they had been allowed to live and work and trade, Al-Qaeda operatives, for several years. At that point, and I think this is a particularly important point to make, particularly to 1 in 4 citizens who weren't around at this point, there was absolutely unanimous support that something needed to be done. And within a matter of days, President Bush had gotten the approval of Congress to act to eliminate the Al-Qaeda network and bring to justice, or eliminate, the architects of the attacks. There was a vote in Congress, and it's important that people remember the vote in Congress was not for war against Afghanistan. It was to deal with the immediate threat. The immediate threats are really those 2 goals: eliminating the opportunity for Al-Qaeda to have a network in Afghanistan, and to bring the leaders of Al-Qaeda to justice, or to capture or kill them. Congress voted within a matter of days. The vote was 98-0 in the Senate, and it was 420-1 in the House of Representatives. NATO immediately supported the United States. Remember, any attack on a NATO country brings all of NATO in. The UN Security Council unanimously, that means also Russia, and it also means China, supported whatever action was necessary to neutralize this threat. And so in a matter of just weeks, on the 7th of October, the United States went into Afghanistan and had those two goals that had been articulated. Within 6 weeks, most people would say those goals had been realized. So the Taliban government had disappeared, in essence. It was not going to be providing a safe haven for al-Qaeda. The government, within 6 weeks, had completely fallen. And most of the leadership of al-Qaeda had been neutralized. Osama bin Laden had not been captured. There was a firefight at Tora Bora, a mountainous cave area in the northwest corner of Afghanistan. And he, as we all know later, escaped across the border to Pakistan. But in terms of what had been sought by President Bush from Congress, our objectives had been pretty much realized much faster than anyone expected, with lower casualties than people had expected. The number of US casualties was only 20 at that point. And 6 weeks later, in December of 2021, we found ourselves in the position of having accomplished what the two initial goals had been, and then wondering what happened next. Because what we did very quickly see that was the case in Afghanistan is that getting out was going to be much more difficult than getting in the first place. I think it's also important to remember, especially when we're talking about lessons observed but not necessarily really learned. When the United States went in 2021, President Bush on numerous occasions said, "We've learned the lesson from Vietnam. We are not going to get into the quagmire of Vietnam. We do not want to build nations. We are going to get in quickly and out quickly." What Bush ran on as in his campaign in 2000 was a policy of fewer nation building exercises, criticized the Clinton administration from having done too many that were unfocused. And so everyone said the right things and meant it at the beginning. This was not going to be another protracted Vietnam type of war. But very, very quickly, it became apparent that once having arrived in Afghanistan, we, in a sense, owned it, and we saw that there were some real big issues that needed to be taken care of in Afghanistan. The first things that were done was a leader needed to be appointed, and there was no government there. Remember, the Taliban had left, and before that, there had been a vacuum and then 10 years of absolute destruction during the Soviet occupation. At least 5 million refugees. A famine had begun, and the United States was already providing humanitarian support for the famine long before 9/11 happened. And so we found ourselves in a situation where there needed to be some sort of government to replace the Taliban government that had disappeared very quickly. A president was selected, an interim president in 2001 at a conference in Bonn in Germany that was brokered through the UN. But the Taliban was not invited to attend. And in retrospect, this seems to be a serious omission in the sense that we're now 20 years later trying to have discussions with the Taliban about a way forward. I think what's important to then think about in terms of what cost Afghanistan has been to us, maybe just a couple of facts would be useful, again, particularly for those Americans who were born after this war began. The war in Afghanistan was longer than World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined. What we as a country spent in Afghanistan in real dollars, so in other words, inflation adjusted dollars, just in Afghanistan alone was higher than what we as the United States spent on the entire Marshall Plan in Western Europe to rebuild the countries of Western Europe after World War II. The costs are still being computed, but Brown University's done a very good job on the Forever Wars on its costs of war project. And it estimates that the cost of Afghanistan alone has been up to now about $2.3 trillion. That doesn't include anything with the withdrawal. And it also doesn't include an estimated another trillion over the next couple of decades on taking care of veterans that fought in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So $2.3 trillion, it does sound like a lot of money, but maybe to put it in perspective, because no one can think in trillions. President Biden, when he was justifying his decision for ending this forever war, used the statistic, which I think gives a much better perspective, that $2.3 trillion represents about $300 million a day, every day, for the last 2 decades. So hugely expensive in terms of costs, even more expensive in the human loss that both sides have incurred, many, many deaths, both military and civilian. And what I think is important for the 1 in 4 Americans who weren't born then to realize is that this was the first big war that we also fought basically on a credit card. In other words, the younger generations are going to be paying this for this war for a long period of time. In Vietnam, for example, in Korea, for example, both presidents, Truman and Johnson, raised taxes to cover many of the costs of those wars. We almost did the contrary. The Bush administration lowered taxes. And so much of this is, as I say, it's on credit, and we're going to be thinking about it for a long period of time. But within a very short period of time, what we had added to our list of things to get done in Afghanistan before we left was to provide economic assistance and development assistance in the humanitarian assistance. And that probably could have been done as a discrete, and should have been done as a discrete goal. But the other goal that crept in, and if there was ever an example of mission creep, Afghanistan is kind of the quintessential example. We decided that we needed to, as a goal, have a democratic, moderate government exist in Afghanistan. We didn't know how we were going to do that, and we didn't know with whom we were going to be doing that. We did it with the interim president that was appointed, Hamid Karzai. But when Ryan Crocker was sent to Afghanistan in December of 2001, and his instructions were literally, we don't know what you should do. Please go there and figure something out. He reported back to Washington that it was going to be a huge challenge. There was an interim authority, but with no credibility whatsoever. There was nothing to work with. There was empty safe in the central bank. There was no military. There was no police. There was no civil service. There was no functioning society. There wasn't even any currency. It just didn't exist. So suddenly, we found ourselves in a situation where we needed to create a government, and we decided that we would take, as Americans often do, we would have very ambitious goals and not think too much on how long it was going to take. So in looking at them, I think the best summary of it was from Ryan Boucher, who at the time ended up being the assistant secretary for this region. And in his interviews, when he was talking about it, he said from the very beginning, people recognized that the goal was literally impossible. We wanted to create, and I think it's really interesting to listen to this, listen to what we wanted to create in Afghanistan under these circumstances, and ask yourself if we really have all of those things in the way we want in the United States today. We wanted to create a stable US-style government in Afghanistan with democratic elections, a functioning and credible Supreme Court, an anti-corruption authority, a women's ministry, and thousands of new public schools with a modernized curriculum. That was our goal. it was estimated by people on the ground, including the ambassador, the first ambassador who was sent to Afghanistan, that a minimum of 20 years needed to be committed to just getting to the minimum standards of what we were asking for. The British, who were in there in a big way with NATO as well, estimated 30 to 40 years. When Robert Gates was appointed Secretary of Defense by President Bush in 2006 and stayed on with Obama, he reported to both presidents at the time that these goals were a pipe dream that would take generations to realize. So we knew it at the time, but again, we owned the problem, so we did everything that we could to address some of those concerns. At the same time, we needed to build a military that didn't exist. And we tried to do that up about 350 to 400,000 in the military and the Afghan police in a society where illiteracy reigned. At that time, it was estimated that of the recruits that were going into the military, fewer than 5% were literate at the level of a third grader. So this is what we were attempting to do. It was almost an impossible task that was going to take a very long period of time in a society that was riven by factional differences, warlords, and the world's leading 80 to 90% of the world's supply of opium, for heroin as well. Where we really found ourselves going off track was by 2003, even late in 2002, we shifted our attention greatly to Iraq, deciding that this is where the war on terror needed to take place next. So we put all of our focus on Iraq, beginning certainly in 2003 in March, when the war in Iraq began, but even as late as 2002, Afghanistan became something of a sideshow. Much too little money was put in the early days in Afghanistan, which is ironic because then when we couldn't figure out what to do later, we put too much money in during a period of time that flooded the country with money and led to more corruption during the Obama administration as well. We had 3 presidents who were elected saying to the American people that they were running on a campaign of getting us out of Afghanistan. That was President Obama, then it was President Trump, then it was President Biden. We looked at our strategies over and over again, and we had 10 strategies that were written in the period of time that we were there. That's an average of once every 2 years, in trying to come up with what we thought would be the best way forward. It was a really back and forth. Let's withdraw as many people as we can. No, let's put more people in and have surges. Let's try to put more money in there. We wanted to get out, but we were unable to get out. Trump, when he came in, said he was going to do what Obama, at the very end of his administration, found that he was unable to do. So the Obama administration, by the end of December 2014, had said, well, this mission is accomplished. Enduring freedom is over. We are going to stop our combat role, and we are just going to stay to support the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces. That turned out really not to be the case. We were drawn back into fighting within days, actually, of this proclamation. But at that point, the Afghan military did take ownership of the majority of the fighting, but with a huge amount of support from the US. And by the time that Obama had left, he realized that anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 US forces, plus all of our contractors, needed to remain on the ground, so as not to create a vacuum, as we had found in Iraq when we left in 2010, that by removing everyone and doing it too quickly led to more problems, ISIS in the case of Iraq, that required us to send in troops later and to deal with a messy problem. So Biden was very clear from the beginning that he was going to finish what Trump said that he had already started doing, which was a timed departure from Iraq in conversations and discussions with the Taliban, who had never gone away, who had gone really into Pakistan for most of the war, and then gradually started coming back in as early as 2003. We had conversations with the Taliban. We announced that we were going to be leaving in 2021. By the time that Trump had left, there were still folks on the ground, about 3,500 plus 15,000 contractors. And Biden, after being encouraged to do another strategic review, which he did, announced on April 14th of this year that we would be pulling out by September 11th. I think pretty much everyone from all sides would agree that the withdrawal, the execution of the withdrawal, no matter what side one falls on, well, should we have left anybody in at all or not, was handled less well than it should have been. It will be something that we will have to be sorting out again for years and years. But a couple of lessons, and I'm just going to throw out these ideas and then open it to discussion. 7 or 8 things that I would think probably we do need to just think about. First, in order for the lessons to have any validity, we have to quit making it a partisan issue. This is easy this one time. We have 4 administrations that have made consistent mistakes with Afghanistan, 2 Republican, 2 Democrat. There's credit for what we did accomplish to go around for both, but there's blame to go around for both. So it can't be a partisan issue if we want to draw lessons for the future. A couple of the lessons that we're already drawing have become almost like memes. We never should do nation building or democracy building again. Well, perhaps not, but that's something that certainly we should open to discussion, because this will happen again in the future, that we will want to support countries that are working hard to open their political and their economic systems, and we need and want to be helpful. What did we do wrong in Afghanistan that we might be able to be helpful doing right the next time? Among some of the lessons that we've learned is you don't build countries in the image of the United States if it doesn't fit. We have a tendency to make things too centralized. In other words, a big federal government, as we have in the United States, and then devolving to the states. We have a tendency to judge the success by having big national elections early on. And we declared great success when we had a national election in Afghanistan in 2004. But probably a much better way of doing it would be to start small and local and start establishing democratic systems and processes in countries where they don't exist before doing things on a grand scale. And the other thing that I think is really essential is that when somebody says we're going to work on democracy building, it's something that has to be looked at objectively in terms of this is a long-term goal. We have to deal with the issue of money. As I said at the beginning, too little money came in at the beginning and much too much at the end. And it wasn't just a matter of huge corruption in Afghanistan. The system itself encouraged corruption. Some have said that the US military's supply chain itself was the biggest contributor to corruption because of the amount of money that came in. Some, like Ryan Boucher, said probably it would have been better not giving so much money to Beltway contractors from the United States, where 80 to 90% of what was spent went on overhead, that it might have been better just to do it smaller scale and directly. And there was always the pressure to spend, and to spend as fast as they could. And that's something that I saw when I was in Iraq, for example, got into a very heated argument that ended up being reported in a book, and I had to go back and try to justify it later, where with the military, I blocked an agreement. They just wanted me to sign on a dotted line. They were opening a school of English that was only going to cost $30 million for training Iraqi military to speak English better, and just wanted the State Department to sign on the dotted line that it would supply teachers in perpetuity for this. Well, $30 million by State Department standards for somebody in my position and career was a ton of money, and I knew that the State Department did not have the capability of doing that. But there was such pressure to spend all of the money that Congress had allocated that it wasn't spent very well. And SIGIR, the organization that I told you, the Inspectors General, estimates that at least 30% of what we spent in Afghanistan was lost to corruption and to maladministration. I think the other thing that is probably really important to remember is you need to go into a country and understand it. One of the interviews from SIGIR that is just withering was with an Afghan minister, a cabinet minister, who said Americans would come in having read, if they were being really conscientious and trying to learn something, The Kite Runner on the novel, The Kite Runner, on the plane on their way over, and then would only be there 6 months to a year, and then another rotation would come in. So there was very little understanding linguistically, culturally, and historically of the time that was there. The other lesson that we need to learn is there needs to be a coherent policy. You can't say a mission is accomplished if you haven't defined what the mission is. Those mission goals need to be set by conditions and not by timelines that are arbitrary. And then maybe the last meme that is out there is, well, this really wasn't our fault. No one could have anticipated that the Afghan military would just not have the will to fight. This is a little bit facile and it's a little bit too easy. The Afghan military had been fighting and had been doing pretty much all of the fighting every year in the last 6 or 7 years. The Afghan military has lost more soldiers than the United States did in the entire year. But once a decision was made not only to remove all US forces from Afghanistan, but also to remove all of the contractors, 15,000 of them, who were there in country to keep the planes running, to keep the equipment running, to provide the necessary infrastructural support and air cover for the Afghan military. It wasn't a surprise that the military dissolved as quickly as it did at the time of the withdrawal, just as the Taliban disappeared very, very quickly 20 years earlier in 2001, when people read very easily the tea leaves on who was going to win and who was going to lose, and they made their decisions accordingly. So at that point, I think, those are a lot of lessons that need to be talked about for the next 20 years, but it is going to have really big implications for the way foreign policy goes forward in the next generations. We've lost a good deal of credibility and trust. It's going to take a while to recreate that. And that's probably a starting point for questions. And so I'll pass it over to the real Professor Doherty now and go from there. Again, I'm sorry, it is hard to summarize 20 years in 25 minutes. So
I have to say, Ambassador Doherty, you did a heck of a job, I think. I really appreciated the contextualizing of all this and how quickly we forget sometimes. 20 years seems forever ago, and then it seems connected today. We do have some questions, so I'll get us started with those questions in the Q&A. So thanks, folks. I'm going to combine two questions into one, as my prerogative as moderator has. There seems to be an overarching theme here around the role of America right now and the role of the Taliban in the next steps forward in Afghanistan. So one question is around what will the U.S. support look like moving forward for nation building in Afghanistan, if we want to use that term, and how can the Taliban, if at all, gain credibility in establishing their government? They're not parallel, but they're basically the two players right now in this space.
I think they are. They're very parallel, and they're really, really important. So it was clear, and there were a lot of signals going back to the time of Obama, that we were going to need to talk to the Taliban. It was actually even clear in 2001 that the Taliban should have been in those talks in Germany in deciding how we were going to go forward. But certainly there were overtures in the Obama administration. And then during the Trump administration, talks were held with the Taliban in Doha, in Qatar, beginning in 2017, 2018, on the way forward. So I think there was already an acceptance there that, the Taliban weren't going to go away, and there was going to be a need to figure out a way to work with them. Just as it was a mistake not to have included the Taliban in 2001, it was just amazing that the decision was made during the Trump administration that the talks would take place between the US and the Taliban. And we, forgot to invite the government of Afghanistan, the sitting government in Afghanistan, to be part of it. So now we're doing catch up, seeing if there are Taliban forces that we can work with. There are some strategic things we have in common. Remember, the Taliban also is facing a threat, a counterterrorism threat from ISIS-type organizations. So we do have that in common. And so there's hope that there might be something we could do with the Taliban. But the signals lately haven't been particularly encouraging. So we had hoped at the beginning that there would be some moderate forces, but there's been infighting among the Taliban, and some of the most extreme elements are currently in the government. But it's tricky. How do you deal with a government that is going to exclude 50% of the population? You know, one thing that I don't know if everyone at Simmons is aware of, but the current Afghan ambassador to the United States started in July, just in time for the withdrawal, but before that had been Afghanistan's ambassador to the United Nations, is a very dynamic young woman who's a Simmons graduate. It's kind of the example of what we did kind of do right in Afghanistan. She went to school in Afghanistan. I remember no girls went to school. Very few boys were even going to school, but certainly no girls. Father had been killed by the Taliban for being too moderate. Studied hard, went to Simmons. I think she was a triple major. Professor Doherty and others know her. Went back to Afghanistan, did work there, did some major NGO work too, and then is here and is currently trying to hold down some semblance of the last vestige of the government at the Afghan embassy in Washington, D.C. So can we work on rebuilding a government with a government that is excluding 50% of the population? That's not going to be an easy ask. Certainly, the Taliban needs support. They have some big economic challenges. They can't pay their bills, literally, and they're afraid that the electricity and the power is going to be turned off in the coming weeks. But there are other players out there that might be willing to step in who don't have the same interests or ideals as the United States, to include Pakistan, to include Iran, to include China, and to include Russia. So I think we have very little leverage. And in an interview that was done with Ambassador De La Raz just in the last week or two, when she was asked that same question, it was like, well, what leverage is there left for the United States now? Perhaps having kept a residual force on the ground in Afghanistan, even a small one, perhaps enabling the contractors to stay, even if there weren't going to be active forces, would have given some leverage. But right now we have very few cards to play.
That gets to our next question. And it is about Russia and former Soviet states. Do you think the lack of cooperation or assistance by post-Soviet states, especially Russia, should have signaled caution when dealing with Russia that was ignored by our former leaders? And also another question, could you speak of Pakistan as well? So I think folks are interested in the role of former Soviet Union, Russia. Was there a signal there? Should we have paid more attention? And then moving forward on that, what would be the next role of Pakistan in a be careful what you wish for kind of way? Two very different nations, but similar interests, right?
Yeah. With Russia, to begin with, I think one thing, again, really important for the 1 in 4 that weren't born then, on September 12th of 2001, pretty much everyone in the world was supportive of the United States, including Russia, including Pakistan, including countries that later started saying, wait a second, this is overreach by the United States, and that included Russia. So we had great opportunities to work with Russia in 2001. As I mentioned, the UN Security Council was unanimous, Russia and China as well, in the support of US initial aims in Afghanistan. It wasn't until we started Iraq and a more global war on terrorism. We now are active in 85 countries around the world in this global war on terrorism, that we started not having support from those that could have provided a good deal of support. Remember, Russia had very similar interests. Russia did not want to see al-Qaeda thriving in Afghanistan either. And in fact, at the beginning, and it wasn't until kind of late in the 90s when bin Laden shifted his animus against the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Russia. Remember, there were many attacks in Chechnya and in other former republics of the Soviet Union against Russia. So we had commonality there. With Pakistan, it's a really, really, really tricky situation, and it was from the beginning. So we know, for example, that Pakistan was helpful on certain things, but we also knew from the first day that they were unhelpful on other things. What we forget is the Taliban is basically Pashtun. There are 28 million Pashtuns in Pakistan. They have a commonality of being against the extremist terrorist organizations, including the Pakistan Taliban. And so we needed to expect that Pakistan had strong strategic reasons for wanting to see things go in a way that was amenable to Pakistan from the very beginning. We looked away at a lot of things in Pakistan because we really needed them. We looked away because Pakistan is a nuclear power, and in the late 90s, early aughts, there was great tension with India that could have caused a nuclear war. But a couple of things to remember. So we have trouble controlling, and again, I'm being bipartisan on this one, our border with Mexico. The US border with Mexico is only like, I think, 300 miles shorter than the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Plus, there's no Rio Grande River to help you out. It's just all mountains and impenetrable passes. So to think that Pakistan was going to be able to somehow blockade people going back and forth into Afghanistan was unrealistic. There was also something really interesting in the Afghan papers that Ambassador Crocker reported at one unguarded moment when he was speaking with the head of intelligence, military intelligence in Pakistan. He said to him, Crocker, he said, it looks to me like you're kind of hedging your bets. You know, you say you're working with us, but you're also seeming not to work with us. And what was really interesting was the Pakistani, in an either deliberate or unguarded moment, said, yes, we are hedging our bets because we think you're going to leave someday and we're still going to be here. And, you know, in a sense, it was prophetic. Pakistan is coming off somewhat better today than it looked, 10, 15 years ago. So the role of Pakistan is essential. We're going to need to work with Pakistan real carefully. There is the potential, perhaps, and kind of ironically, when you think about it, that we would ask Pakistan to help be a moderating influence in Afghanistan, but those are the cards that we're dealt with right now. The other choices, Iran isn't going to be particularly helpful to US interests at this point.
The next kind of series of questions are all tied to questions around military. And I think there's one question that's more of a maybe analytical question, and two others that are more folks are looking for your opinion a little bit on this. So I'll pose them all kind of together. The idea of the phraseology of the military industrial complex that we have in the United States, the professionalization of our military and what it does and the like. We have a question from Dr. Amato, one of the faculty members in the department, asking for you to talk a little more about what's the significance of that military industrial complex to the longevity of the war. And so that's more the analytical kind of where that fits in. The other two are about the forces themselves and the withdrawal. And basically they're questions of the drawdown itself. One is more about the transition and its lack of, I think you put the lack of success, right? Or whatever words we're using around that. And its suddenness, or its appearing to be suddenness, and would a gradual withdrawal have helped? And a more kind of specific question around that, what can the US government do now for those forces that have been withdrawn in such a rapid way, as far as support is concerned, in your opinion?
The first question is a really, really big question and a really, really important one. And it's just as applicable to Iraq and our experience there and around the world. The militarization of US foreign policy. Really an important factor. I'm not in any way anti-military, but there has been absolute mission creep over the last 20, 30, 40 years. I don't want to blame this on the military. I think the one lesson that we can agree on, all the administration's conduct of policy in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, is that there has been an absolutely disastrous failure of civilian leadership on the part of our most senior leaders. What is the policy? The United States is premised on civilian control of the military. So military has all the resources. They have all the money. Robert Gates, as Secretary of Defense, pointed out publicly many, many times, and one of these little facts that are unfortunately true. The military, the US military, has more band members than the United States has diplomats. It's the literal truth. So we've allowed the military to grow a great deal. A lot of people made a lot of money. I pointed out what Ryan Boucher had said. 80 to 90% of many of the projects that we did funded Beltway contractors with overhead and salaries and profits. So yes, that complex is absolutely enormous, but we've asked the military then to go in and win wars. They did a really good job. 20 casualties, 6 weeks, harsh terrain in Afghanistan. That's their job. Their job is not narco-terrorism. It's not development. They've tried really, really hard to work in partnership, but they have all of the resources. And there's been mission creep in the military as well. It works to their advantage in some ways, but I don't think we can blame the military for doing it when the civilian leadership is not, and that means us too. It means us all looking at what's going on, because I have to be frank, the other reason I was timid about speaking about Afghanistan is I think all of us just wanted to tune out. I mean, how much focus can you have over 20 years? And Iraq was the bigger show and we kind of moved on, but a real severe lack of oversight and accountability. Congress shares some of the blame on this one. We haven't had Congress debate wars since Korea. The Constitution says Congress debates wars. That requires, I would guess, an executive to put, here's what the mission of the war is. Do you give us our approval or not? So I think it's civilian leadership that really has the most to learn. The military's role needs to remain military, but the control of that must be civilian. So that's what I would say about the military industrial complex. And it's interesting that some of the people that have identified that the most, going back to Eisenhower himself, are military leaders. So they get it as well. They shouldn't be asked to do things out of their purview. In terms of what could have been perhaps looking at the lesson of the withdrawal, here I think you can debate whether any boots should have been left on the ground. This was an unwinnable war, but I think not just with the withdrawal, but all through our surges and our conditions, the conditions have to be met. You don't set arbitrary timelines and tell people on April 14th, we're going to be out. What would you do if you were in the military when Bagram suddenly is closed in July? The handwriting was on the wall. It was really interesting. Ron Newman, who was the ambassador in Afghanistan, recently talked about his last visit to Afghanistan in July. And he wrote, along with all the former ambassadors in Afghanistan, op-eds in the Washington Post and elsewhere, that we shouldn't be moving this quickly, that we need to make sure that we do it orderly and get the people out that helped us, and did it as recently as the very end of July, but was in Afghanistan in July and said he was stunned that Afghan contacts, people he'd known for a long time, actually thought, have you all, meaning Americans, have you all changed your minds? Are you changing sides? Do you like the Taliban now? That was the perception that was there. So the issue of morale is easy to understand with the military. If the perception was, you're going home, but we're going to be left here, what do we do?
And I think to that point, right? And now what, right? You know, the kind of last, kind of to wrap this up today, is to that point of what is the role of the American government now with our own forces that have been withdrawn quickly, and to your point, we've all ebbed and flowed in our interest in this area, right? Personal interest, professional interest, and the like. And to that point, and a kind of last point, is there a possibility we might go back? I like the phrasing of this question. Despite public perception, this is still at the core a problem that we created, right? We being, you know, after the first 6 weeks, you know, of 20 years of I like that phrasing of the mission creep of all of this, right? So, well, your last kind of thoughts on both of those areas.
We absolutely have said we're not going to go back in, but I want to remind people that we said the same thing in 2010 when we left Iraq. So Obama comes in, he has said we need to get out of Iraq, and he was right. And the only thing that was going to remain was a stationing of forces agreements. We weren't going to be providing combat. They were trainers. The Iraqis were such pains to deal with that there was great frustration in Washington, and eventually a mistake. We just said, well, the heck with you. Then we're not even going to leave the trainers that were there. We weren't going to go back in. Then ISIS happened. Mm-hmm. Now we're back in. We don't talk about it, but so that was a lesson we probably should have learned for now as well, in leaving contractors and maybe some trainers behind in Afghanistan. We say outright we will not go back in, but some people, particularly of the neocon persuasion, say, oh, we're going to go back in. If it turns out that Afghanistan supports a network that's going to be an external threat to the United States, it's very possible that we could find ourselves needing to go in. The Biden administration has said we have over-the-horizon capabilities. Maybe not so much. That last drone attack was kind of an example of how effective our missile attack, when we got the wrong people, that over-the-horizon capabilities aren't particularly strong. So the official answer is we're not going to go back in. We'll look at how we can cooperate with the Taliban. But what is really unfortunate is that we've left a lot of people behind. And again, that interview I found heartbreaking with Ambassador Raz is, what leverage does the United States have to do it right now? We've lost credibility in Afghanistan. We forget we've lost a lot of credibility with our allies. NATO allies and Australia and other countries were really flummoxed when the April 14th announcement came out before they'd been consulted. And so there was a mad scramble to get everybody out in a way that they probably wouldn't have done it otherwise.
Any last remarks to folks? We had a great attendance. We hope to do this again soon, something like this, moving forward. So if you have ideas for topics that is of interest, to our community, that Ambassador Doherty and I can muddle our way through together, we're happy to do that. Ambassador Doherty is teaching next semester a course called Human Insecurity, Unsecurity, All the Securities, Lack Thereof. So if you're interested in that, take a look. I know students are enjoying a senior seminar this semester, as are we, having him on board as part of our team in the department. Thanks again for taking the time, everybody. Ambassador Doherty, this is great. Good job.
Professor Doherty, if I could say one thing that's just a little bit more, this has been, the forever wars are not good, but we do need to go forward. And so just thinking about human security, it was a reminder, and probably, again, worth telling the 1 in 4 that were born after the forever wars. We have really huge opportunities to do things right in the world. And some of it, like on human security, the US plays the biggest role in the world, really, on many of those issues that are important to us, such as food security and such as health security and so on. So I'd like just kind of to lead on an up note. If we learn lessons well, and that's probably the most important thing from the mistakes that we've made this time, we have the opportunity to set things right. It shouldn't be all bleak. I feel very guilty about just saying, well, and then we did this wrong, and then we did this wrong, and then we did this wrong. But we can do some things right. And no matter what we've done wrong, we have a really important role to play. And there are areas in human security around the world where the United States really does have the expertise and the values that can be positive. So I want to end on a slightly positive note on what is really a pretty negative experience in terms of the Afghan war.
That's a great place to stop. Thanks so much for everyone coming today, and we hope to see you soon. Take good care and be healthy. Bye-bye.